They say you never really know someone until you see them during a crisis. I learned this lesson the hard way when my husband David fell into a coma after a devastating workplace accident. In those dark days that followed, I discovered the true face of my mother-in-law, Patricia Hamilton, and it wasn't the carefully maintained mask of maternal affection I'd known for the past 8 years. I still remember that Tuesday morning with painful clarity. David had kissed me goodbye as usual, his coffee thermos in hand, promising to pick up Thai food for dinner on his way home from the construction site he was supervising. "Don't forget the extra spring rolls this time," I called after him, making him laugh. That was the last time I heard his voice. The call came at 2:47 p.m. A crane had malfunctioned, they said. David had pushed 2 workers out of the way, saving their lives, but couldn't clear the falling beam himself. He was alive, barely, but unresponsive. By the time I reached Metro General Hospital, my hands shaking so badly I could barely park the car, Patricia was already there, holding court in the waiting room. "Emma, finally," she said, her voice carrying that familiar note of disapproval I'd grown used to over the years. "I've been trying to reach you for an hour. I checked my phone, no missed calls, no messages. It was the first of many lies, but I was too distraught to notice." The doctor spoke in careful, measured terms about traumatic brain injury, intracranial pressure, and medically induced coma. They needed to keep him under to let his brain heal, they explained. Days, possibly weeks. Patricia nodded along, asking technical questions while I stood there, my world crumbling around me, struggling to process that my vibrant, loving husband now lay still and silent, connected to more machines than I could count. "I'll handle everything," Patricia announced after the doctors left. "I know how to manage these situations." She'd been a hospital administrator before retirement, a fact she never let anyone forget. "Emma, dear, you should go home and rest. I'll stay with David." But I couldn't leave him. I spent that first night in the uncomfortable hospital chair, holding David's hand, talking to him softly about nothing and everything, while Patricia made calls and spoke in hushed tones with various hospital staff. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to those whispered conversations. The first hint of trouble came 3 days later. I'd barely left David's side, sleeping in short bursts in that same chair, when Patricia entered with a man in an expensive suit. "Emma, this is Mr. Harrison, the family's attorney," she said, her voice carefully modulated. "We need to discuss David's medical care." I straightened in my chair, suddenly alert despite my exhaustion. "What about it?" "The doctors say he's stable. The experimental treatment I've arranged," Patricia said, as if explaining something to a child. "It's very expensive, but it could help David wake up sooner. The doctors agree it's his best chance." I frowned. "What experimental treatment?" "The doctors haven't mentioned anything to me." "Because they were discussing it with me," Patricia's voice took on an edge. "I'm his mother, and I know what's best for my son. Mr. Harrison is here because we need you to sign some papers." The attorney stepped forward, placing a thick folder on the small table beside David's bed. "Mrs. Hamilton has arranged for David to be transferred to a private facility specializing in traumatic brain injury. However, the treatment isn't covered by insurance. We'll need to liquidate some assets." "What assets?" I asked, my throat tightening. "The house," Patricia said simply. "You'll need to sign it over to cover the treatment costs." The house, our dream home that we spent 5 years saving for, that David and I had painted ourselves, where we planned to raise our family. My head spun. "I don't understand," I managed. "The insurance, David's work insurance should cover his treatment." Patricia's face hardened. "The insurance has limits. This treatment is experimental. It's not covered. Emma, if you care about David at all, you'll sign these papers." I stared at the documents Mr. Harrison had placed before me, the words swimming before my eyes. "I need time to think about this, to review everything." "There isn't time," Patricia snapped. "The facility has a waiting list. If we don't secure David's place now, we'll lose it. Do you want that on your conscience? Do you want to be responsible for keeping my son in a coma because you're too selfish to sign a few papers?" I looked at David's still face, at the machines keeping him alive, at the mother who'd raised him standing over me with steel in her eyes. My hand trembled as I reached for the pen. "Just sign here, here, and here," Mr. Harrison indicated, flipping through pages too quickly for me to read. "It's all standard procedure." I signed. Patricia's smile reminded me of a cat that had caught its prey. You've done the right thing, dear. Now, why don't you go home and get some proper rest? I'll stay with David. Exhausted and emotional, I did as she suggested. It wasn't until I was driving home that the full weight of what I'd done hit me. I'd signed away our house, our future, without even reading the documents properly. But it was for David, I told myself. To help him wake up. To bring him back to me. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital to find David's room empty. Patient transfer, the nurse explained when I frantically asked where he was. Early this morning, his mother handled all the paperwork. My calls to Patricia went straight to voicemail. When I finally reached Mr. Harrison's office, his secretary informed me he was unavailable. For days, I tried desperately to find out where David had been transferred, but every inquiry hit a wall of medical privacy regulations and legal jargon. It took me 2 weeks to discover the horrible truth. 2 weeks of sleepless nights, unanswered calls, and growing desperation. Finally, a junior nurse who'd been sympathetic to my daily visits took pity on me. "Mrs. Foster," she said quietly, pulling me aside one afternoon. "There's something you should know. There was no transfer to a specialty facility." My blood ran cold. "What?" "Your husband is at Lakeside General. It's just a regular hospital in the next town." And she hesitated, looking around nervously. "The treatment they're giving him is standard protocol for coma patients. Nothing experimental." The world tilted sideways as the implications sank in. There was no expensive experimental treatment, no specialty facility, just Patricia, the documents I'd signed without reading, and our house. My house now, that I'd signed away for nothing. When I confronted Mr. Harrison, he was surprisingly frank. The property transfer was legal, he said, not quite meeting my highs. "You signed voluntarily. Under false pretenses." I protested. She lied about the treatment, about everything. He shuffled some papers on his desk. "Mrs. Foster, I understand you're upset, but my client." "Your client defrauded me while my husband was lying in a coma." I cut him off, my voice shaking with rage. "How do you sleep at night?" He had no answer for that. I drove straight to Lakeside General, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Patricia was there, of course, installed in a chair by David's bed, as if she owned him, owned everything. "How could you?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "How could you lie to me like that? Use David's condition to steal our house?" She looked up at me calmly, almost pityingly. "I did what I had to do to protect my son's interests. You're just the woman he married. I'm his mother. I know what's best for him. By stealing the home he worked so hard for, the home we chose together." "That house should have been his alone," she sniffed. "He never should have put your name on the deed. I'm simply correcting a mistake." I stared at her, finally seeing her clearly for the first time. This woman who'd smiled at our wedding while disapproving of every choice. Who'd given backhanded compliments and subtle digs wrapped in concern. Who'd waited for her moment of maximum advantage to show her true colors. "You won't get away with this," I promised her quietly. She smiled, that same predatory smile I'd seen the day she brought the papers. "I already have, dear. Now, why don't you run along home?" "Oh, wait." Her laugh followed me out of the room. But Patricia didn't know everything. She didn't know about the conversations I'd had with David's doctors before she orchestrated her deception. She didn't know about the insurance paperwork I'd already filed or the emails I'd exchanged with the hospital's patient advocate. Most importantly, she didn't know about the small recording device in my pocket the day she made me sign those papers. The one that captured every word of her lies about the experimental treatment. I left the hospital that day with my head held high, stopping only to make 2 phone calls. The first was to Sarah Chin, a lawyer friend who specialized in elder abuse and financial fraud. The second was to Detective Marcus Rodriguez, who'd taken my statement about suspected medical fraud the week before. Patricia thought she'd won, but the game wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, hospital visits, and sleepless nights. I'd moved in with my best friend Lisa after Patricia's scheme forced me out of our home. Each morning, I woke up on Lisa's pull-out couch with the same thought: fight back. Sarah Chen, my lawyer, turned out to be a blessing. "The good news," she said during our first meeting, "is that Patricia got greedy. She made mistakes." I leaned forward in my chair. "What kind of mistakes?" Sarah spread several documents across her desk. First, she claimed to be acting with medical authority she didn't have. David's medical power of attorney was updated last year. She tapped a document with her pen. You're listed as his primary decision maker, not his mother. My hands trembled as I remembered the conversation David and I had about this very thing. He said he wanted me to be the one to make decisions if anything ever happened to him. Exactly, Sarah nodded. Patricia had no legal right to arrange any transfers or experimental treatments. But here's where it gets interesting. She pulled out another document, the property transfer she forced you to sign. It wasn't to pay for medical treatment at all. She transferred the house directly into her name. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. She owns our house now. On paper, yes, but not for long. Sarah's smile was fierce. We have evidence of coercion, fraudulent medical claims, and your recording of her lies about the experimental treatment. Plus, she added, pulling out another file, I had an interesting conversation with Mr. Harrison's former legal assistant. Former? He quit after your case. Apparently, his conscience couldn't handle being part of Patricia's scheme. He's willing to testify about how she planned this, how she waited until you were exhausted and emotional to present those papers. Hope fluttered in my chest for the first time in weeks. So we can get the house back. We can do more than that, Sarah promised. We can make sure Patricia faces consequences for what she did. Detective Rodriguez proved equally helpful. Financial exploitation of a family in medical crisis is a serious offense, he explained during one of our meetings. Add in the fraudulent medical claims, and Mrs. Hamilton could be looking at criminal charges. But Patricia wasn't going down without a fight. She hired an expensive legal team that tried to paint me as an opportunistic gold digger who had married David for his potential inheritance. They claimed Patricia had acted to protect family assets from my undue influence. The battle might have dragged on for months, but then something unexpected happened. David opened his eyes. I was sitting beside his bed at Lakeside General, reading him the latest chapter of the mystery novel we'd started together before the accident, when I felt his fingers twitch in mine. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. After so many weeks of stillness, of one-sided conversations and desperate prayers, surely it couldn't be this simple. But then his eyelids fluttered, and suddenly I was looking into those familiar brown eyes I'd missed so much. Emma? His voice was barely a whisper, rough from weeks of disuse. I burst into tears, clutching his hand. I'm here, love. I'm right here. The doctors called it a miracle. Patricia called it vindication. You see, she announced triumphantly when she arrived at the hospital. My decisions were the right ones. My son is awake. But David's first coherent questions shattered her narrative. Where's Emma? Why isn't she here? He asked when he woke up to find Patricia by his bed instead of me. She abandoned you. Patricia lied smoothly. Left you here alone while she tried to steal your inheritance. But don't worry, darling, I protected everything. I hadn't been there for that conversation, but the nurse who was told me later that David's heart rate had spiked dangerously. Get out, he had told his mother, his voice weak but firm. Get Emma. I want my wife. When I arrived, David was agitated despite his weakness. She's lying, he said as soon as he saw me. Whatever she told you, she's lying. I know, I soothed him, stroking his hand. Save your strength. We'll figure everything out. But David was insistent. The will, he managed. Me too. Tell you about the will. What about it? Changed it. Last year. After Mom tried to. He drifted off, exhaustion claiming him before he could finish. I mentioned this conversation to Sarah during our next meeting. Her eyes lit up. A new will? That could change everything. It took another 2 weeks of intense physical therapy before David was strong enough to explain fully. Last year, it seemed Patricia had tried to convince him to cut me out of his will entirely. For the good of the family, she'd argued. Instead, her attempt had backfired spectacularly. I realized then what she was really like. David told me from his hospital bed, his voice stronger now but still tired. How she'd always tried to control everything, everyone. So I changed my will. Made sure she couldn't hurt you if anything happened to me. The will reading was scheduled for a week later, at David's insistence. Patricia arrived at the lawyer's office looking triumphant, dressed in an expensive suit that I suspected she'd bought with money from selling our furniture from the house she'd stolen. I don't know why we need this formality, she announced, settling into a chair. Everything is already arranged properly. David's lawyer, Mr. Jensen, cleared his throat. Actually, Mrs. Hamilton, there have been some developments you should be aware of. She waved her hand dismissively. Just read the will so we can finish this nonsense. Mr. Jensen opened a folder and began to read. Within minutes, Patricia's smug expression crumbled. The new will was explicit. Everything David owned was to go to me, with strict provisions preventing any interference from his family. But more than that, there was a separate letter detailing Patricia's history of manipulation and financial control. Furthermore, Mr. Jensen read, if my mother, Patricia Hamilton, attempts to contest this will or interfere with my wife's inheritance in any way, the enclosed documentation of her previous financial misdeeds will be forwarded to the relevant authorities. Patricia's face had turned ashen. What documentation? What is he talking about? That was my cue. I pulled out a thick folder, the one I'd been building for weeks with Sarah's help. Maybe this will refresh your memory, I said, laying out documents one by one. Bank statements showing how you embezzled from David's college fund to pay for your gambling habit. Tax records proving you used his identity to evade debt collectors. And my personal favorite, evidence that you forged his signature on loans that nearly bankrupted him before we met. You can't prove any of that, Patricia sputtered, but her hands were shaking. Actually, Mr. Jensen interjected, everything is quite thoroughly documented. Your son was very thorough in protecting his wife from exactly this kind of situation. Patricia lunged for the documents, but Sarah was faster, sweeping them back into the folder. I wouldn't, she advised coldly. Attempting to destroy evidence won't help your case. My case? Patricia's voice rose hysterically. What case? Detective Rodriguez chose that moment to enter the room. Is timing perfect? Patricia Hamilton. We need to discuss the fraudulent property transfer and some other financial matters. The aftermath was both satisfying and sad. Patricia was arrested, charged with multiple counts of fraud and financial exploitation. The house was returned to me through an emergency court order, though it took weeks to undo the damage Patricia had done to it in her rage. David continued his recovery, growing stronger each day. The first time he came home from the hospital, he paused in our doorway, looking around at the home we'd rebuilt together. I'm so sorry, he said softly, for everything she put you through. I took his hand, squeezing it gently. You have nothing to apologize for. You're the one who made sure she couldn't win in the end. Still, he sighed, she's my mother. I should have seen what she was capable of sooner. You saw it in time, I assured him. That's what matters. Patricia eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for paying restitution. She was sentenced to house arrest and mandatory counseling. Sometimes she still sends letters, long, rambling attempts to justify her actions or demand forgiveness. We return them unopened. The last time I saw her was at the courthouse after her sentencing. She looked smaller somehow, her expensive clothes replaced by something more modest. Her carefully maintained facade finally cracked. I only wanted to protect him, she said as I passed by. Everything I did was for my son. I stopped and turned to face her. No, I said quietly. Everything you did was for yourself. You never saw David as a person, only as a possession. That's why you lost him. She flinched as if I'd struck her, but I was already walking away. Outside, David was waiting by our car, leaning on his cane but standing tall. We had a home to go to, a life to rebuild, and a future that belonged to us alone. They say you never really know someone until you see them during a crisis. But sometimes, a crisis also shows you your own strength, the power to fight back, to stand up, to protect what matters most. Patricia taught me that lesson, though not in the way she intended. Last week, David and I finished repainting our bedroom, erasing the last traces of Patricia's brief ownership of our home. As we stood back admiring our work, David pulled me close. You know what this means? He asked, his eyes twinkling. What? We can finally start working on that nursery we talked about. I smiled, thinking of the pregnancy test hidden in my bedside drawer, waiting for the perfect moment to share its news. Sometimes the best revenge isn't confrontation or justice, it's simply living well, building the life you choose with the people you choose to share it with. Patricia's last letter arrived yesterday. Like all the others, it sits unopened in our paper shredder. We have better things to do than dwell on the past. After all, we have a nursery to plan.